Buongiorno, ben arrivati. Ringrazio tutti i presenti per la partecipazione. Come molti di voi sanno, qui siamo nell'istituto che dunque fino ad oggi si chiama Istituto Centrale per il Restauro e la Conservazione del Patrimonio Archivistico e Librario, ma la nostra richiesta è che ritorni al suo vecchio nome, che è bellissimo perché è Istituto Centrale per la Patologia del Libro.
Accolta.
Grazie. È nato nel 1938, primo istituto di restauro in Italia, ancora oggi leader in tutto il mondo perché il discorso del restauro dei beni del patrimonio archivistico e librario non è così diffuso rispetto ad altre tipologie di restauro. Da noi papiri, pergamene, carte in tutta la loro sistematicità, quindi carta antica, carta moderna, carta contemporanea, lucidi, ma anche carta occidentale e carta orientale, perché dal 2015 abbiamo aperto questa grande collaborazione con i popoli dell'estremo oriente, soprattutto Corea del Sud e Giappone, e con il Giappone proprio per il discorso del sisma, nel senso che loro hanno gli stessi problemi, sisma e tsunami, quindi non solo il problema del terremoto, ma anche il problema dell'acqua salata sui libri e sui documenti. Quindi questo ci sta veramente portando a studiare. Però, essendo un istituto che da sempre si è coniugato con le tecnologie avanzate, abbiamo anche il discorso dei beni cinematografici, dei beni fotografici e dei supporti digitali. Poi per il momento ci siamo fermati e stiamo facendo ricerche però sulle alghe marine mediterranee da usare nel restauro, sugli oli essenziali, sulle nanotecnologie e così via. Quindi siamo abbastanza nella scia del nostro fondatore Alfonso Gallo, che aveva creato questo libro che è la clinica di eccellenza per i libri e per i documenti di archivio. Il libro malato deve venire qui, dove troverà tutte le possibili diagnostiche nei laboratori scientifici di chimica, fisica, biologia, tecnologia, verrà consegnato con le sue schede cliniche ai restauratori che poi provvederanno a iniziare i restauri, a decretare il restauro. E poi il libro viene restituito al proprietario. L'unico infatti discorso di Gallo fu un istituto che non avesse un patrimonio, se non un patrimonio come libri da utilizzare di supporto, perché il vero patrimonio, come nel mondo orientale, sono le persone. Quindi le persone che restaurano, le persone che lavorano a livello scientifico. Da qui è nato anche un grande rapporto con la fondazione della Scuola del Patrimonio, perché appunto si lavora per il patrimonio. Io adesso non mi voglio dilungare, voglio dare soltanto il benvenuto alle persone che sono qui con noi. Sono molto contenta di averli ospitati nel nostro meraviglioso istituto, di cui siamo ovviamente molto innamorati, come si può capire, e molto appassionati. E bene, ben arrivati. Tra l'altro avete appena attraversato il primo orto botanico di Roma, che era il giardino storico in cui noi siamo, e che è stato il primo grande orto botanico con infatti veramente alberi centenari, secolari, e soprattutto con questa volontà di ricostruire il grande giardino di Gallo, che era solo piante cartarie e piante tintorie, e in questo diciamo che l'Estremo Oriente ci sta dando una grande mano. Il papiro ce l'abbiamo da Gallo, quindi il papiro è l'unico sopravvissuto. Grazie mille e passo la parola a Carla.
Grazie. Grazie per l'ospitalità, innanzitutto, in questo bellissimo istituto. We're going to use two different languages today. So I'm going to use English and then Italian maybe, and Lorenzo, I don't know, he will choose. Okay, so distinguished guests and dear students, on behalf of the Fondazione Scuola dei Beni e delle Attività Culturali, of the Commissioner, Dr. Carla Di Francesco, who is seated there, and of the scientific committee of the school. I'm very pleased to welcome you all on the occasion of the International School of Cultural Heritage second public lecture. And I'm honored to welcome and introduce you the heads of cabinet of the two ministries involved. The head of cabinet of the Ministry of Cultural Heritage and Activities and Tourism, Professor Lorenzo Casini, who is a colleague of mine, by the way, and the head of cabinet of the Ministry of Education, University and Research, Dr. Luigi Fiorentino. And our deepest thanks go to the Minister Lorenzo Fioramonti, Minister of Education, who is these days in China, so is unable to be here today with us, but he sent us an opening video message. Then we'll see soon after my words. And it's my privilege also to welcome our speaker today, Christian Greco. He's just there. Christian Greco, who is a director of the Egyptian Museum in Turin, and a member himself of the school's scientific committee and professors at several Italian and foreign universities. I will not even attempt to list because I don't want to take up too much time. This morning he is going to be speaking to us on the topic Digital Revolution and Humanism, a theme that gives us the opportunity to reflect on the relationship between museums and especially cultural heritage, now say cultural heritage and higher education, and on how to improve and strengthen these connections so as to meet the new needs of cultural heritage, at the same time allowing cultural heritage institutions to fully fulfill their role as creators of human capital. And of all the categories of cultural heritage, museums are among the ones that can most implement these relationships. Indeed, museums and higher education institutions share similar values and goals. And here I quote an icon with reference to the museums, where they say museums are inclusive and polyphonic spaces for critical dialogue about the past and the future, enhancing the understanding of the world, a definition that describes universities as well, as we all know. So the benefits of museums and universities partnerships are bidirectional, since museums have radically transformed their policies and practices, increasingly defining themselves as places where new intersections of knowledges are practiced, so able to open up new scenarios for university research and education paths. While universities, for their part, as we all know, produce new knowledge via research, and so they can help museums to expand their vision, but they also transmit knowledge via teaching, so training students or learners to in the higher level skills that are more and more needed to work in the cultural heritage sector. So their joint action can really help reform education. Not surprisingly, over the past decades, a lot of examples of collaborations between them have flourished all over the world and also in Italy, where, however, they still have an episodic and unstable character. Maybe to strengthen these relationships, system policies and procedures seem necessary. So this explains the importance of the joint presence of the two heads of the ministries, Ministry, again, of Education, University and Research, and Ministry for Cultural Heritage and Activities and Tourism. And above all, this explains the importance of the video message from the Minister of Education, Lorenzo Fioramonti. We'll have two different versions, one in Italian and one in English. So I think we can open the work with a video message from the Minister, Lorenzo Fioramonti. First, English. English first.
Yeah. Hi, everyone. I'm in China right now, which is the reason why I can't be with you for this important event. I think the topic of digital revolutions and humanism is central to our debate, not only in Italy, but all over the world. We are witnessing a fundamental industrial revolution, which is likely to change our habits, our societies, and probably shape our future. Now the question is, what kind of future do we want? How do we want to shape it? And that's when humanism comes into play. Because that's exactly what we need. We need a fundamental revision and a mission to make the world a better place and to use the technological revolution to lead us in that direction. Now, I'm very happy that today's lecture will be given by an expert in this field, Professor Christian Greco, who has been able to use technology to revive a sector like archaeology and cultural heritage and take it to the next level. The digital revolution and new technologies can help us understand our past better, to make our past much more close to our habits, to bring it home, if you will. Via digital devices, we can now turn museums into interactive areas, into interactive entities where people from different backgrounds, adults and children, can together become part of a new experience, which brings us closer to the past and projects everything into the future. So I really believe that using technologies with a very important human touch is a fundamental way to make our societies better, to make our economies more dynamic, and at the same time to help us shape a better future.
Now the l'italiano, Italian video message.
La rivoluzione digitale e l'umanesimo, un tema importantissimo, un tema che ci parla della contemporaneità, della rivoluzione, delle evoluzioni, delle tecnologie e al tempo stesso del passato. In questo l'Italia è sicuramente un elemento davvero importante, un paese che si trova al crocevia tra un passato prestigioso, una eredità culturale senza eguali al mondo e al tempo stesso si trova ad affrontare una fase della storia in cui l'innovazione tecnologica sembra cambiare tutto della vita. Ci sono molti esempi di come la nuova digitalizzazione, le tecnologie di ultima generazione possono migliorare il nostro approccio anche al passato, il nostro approccio ai beni culturali, trasformare anche il passato e la grande storia di un paese in qualcosa che può essere vissuto in maniera più dinamica, anche percepito come molto più vicino da parte di tutti. Il Museo Egizio in Italia e tanti altri musei come questo hanno saputo sfruttare questa grande innovazione, questa grande opportunità per rilanciare il tessuto culturale del nostro paese, l'industria culturale, la cosiddetta soft economy. Assolutamente un elemento importante per immaginare un ruolo centrale per il nostro paese e anche essere d'esempio ad altre nazioni come la nostra che vivono la stessa tensione. È davvero una grande opportunità quella di potersi confrontare su queste tematiche e sono molto contento che la Lectio magistralis di oggi venga svolta da una persona che conosce molto bene queste dinamiche perché le ha realizzate in prima persona, quindi il dottor Greco è sicuramente una figura di riferimento in questo contesto. Mi piace anche ricordare come il Ministero dell'Istruzione, dell'Università e della Ricerca insieme al Ministero dei Beni Culturali e del Turismo abbia lavorato per anni al fine di coniugare ricerca, innovazione e promozione e protezione dei beni culturali. E questo connubio, questa interazione che davvero ci deve distinguere, un protocollo d'intesa che esiste tra i nostri ministeri da alcuni anni e che è sicuramente al centro della programmazione politica di questa fase di governo. Quindi sono molto ma molto contento che ci possa essere questo evento oggi, che il dottor Greco saprà sfruttare al massimo per poter dare una serie di indicazioni su come realizzare un percorso dinamico e virtuoso dal punto di vista dell'interazione tra la rivoluzione digitale e il nostro passato, l'umanesimo, e come l'uomo e le nostre riflessioni etico-sociali possano rimanere al centro di quella che è la rivoluzione industriale in corso.
Thank you. Grazie al Ministro. So, now I'm pleased to give the floor to Luigi Fiorentino, Head of Cabinet of the Ministry of Education, University and Research. Now we switch to Italian and then we'll go back to English again. Prego, Luigi.
Grazie, buongiorno a tutti, grazie per l'invito, grazie alla direttrice dottoressa Sebastiani, grazie alla professoressa Barbati, e saluto il direttore del Museo Egizio di Torino. Sono molto contento di essere qui, ho molto pensato che cosa, come approcciare a questo saluto, dopo l'intervento del Ministro, che naturalmente conoscevo nei suoi contenuti, e ho pensato che, ho fatto un po' una riflessione in questi giorni su un tema che secondo me è importante, cioè quali sono le sfide e le strategie per il patrimonio archeologico e qual è la chiave interpretativa per il Ministero presso cui oggi lavoro, cioè il Ministero dell'Istruzione, dell'Università e della Ricerca. Uno dei temi più importanti su cui occorre oggi riflettere credo che sia il tema appunto della gestione dei beni culturali e dei servizi culturali, che richiede necessariamente un approccio attento anche alla valorizzazione economica e quindi a modelli di ricerca e di educazione che siano sintonici rispetto a questi obiettivi. Rispetto a obiettivi di questo tipo non vi è dubbio che il management pubblico dei beni culturali abbia oggi una rilevanza specifica anche per le variegate modalità di estensione che si possono offrire, che vanno appunto dall'amministrazione dei beni all'organizzazione delle strutture dedicate alla erogazione dei servizi, delle politiche per la determinazione appunto dei servizi finali che si danno all'utenza. Intorno alla gestione dei beni culturali, lo sapete bene, anche in virtù della cornice giuridica, del quadro di riferimento giuridico che ha determinato una tutela sempre più ampia, sempre più attenta al valore dei beni stessi, nel tempo si sono strutturate caratteristiche che dicono, che ci mostrano una segmentazione della attività economica che sia attuabile. L'Unione Europea, lo sapete, da tempo considera il complesso settore della cultura come appunto un posizionamento strategico da privilegiare in chiave economica. In questo senso non si può non ricordare un rapporto molto importante, il rapporto Figel del 2006, determinato al fine di intercettare la dimensione specifica dell'economia della cultura rispetto agli obiettivi del Trattato di Lisbona, dove furono individuati per la prima volta i criteri per differenziare in modo precipuo i servizi culturali. Il 2006 quindi è un anno spartiacque per la valutazione sulle scelte pubbliche in tutta Europa, culla della civiltà, della ricchezza del patrimonio culturale in senso lato, ma anche snodo attrattivo preponderante per i servizi di turismo culturale e per la ridefinizione di quelli che possiamo definire driver necessari a ridefinire sfide e strategie. La domanda di servizi culturali con la specifica fruizione è decisamente articolata, il portafoglio d'offerta potenziale in Italia, come tutti noi sappiamo, è molto ampio, dai musei ai monumenti ai siti archeologici, per non parlare dei siti UNESCO. Segnaliamo inoltre diciamo, quell'espressione che si usa molto spesso dire, cioè i musei a cielo aperto, per indicare appunto la ricchezza storica, archeologica e culturale italiana. Questa articolazione del patrimonio dice quindi di una varietà, di un'eterogeneità e di una ricchezza importante. Verso essa è doveroso incanalare tutti gli sforzi per costruire canali privilegiati di attenzione sui versanti che il Ministero dell'Istruzione, dell'Università e della Ricerca, per la sua missione istituzionale e per il suo portafoglio di portatori di interessi, può convogliare tra istruzione e ricerca. Le politiche culturali pubbliche, scelte, indirizzi e misure che siano adottati a tutti i livelli di governo sono azioni che hanno un impatto diretto sulla cultura degli individui e delle società, con effetti diretti anche sulla produzione, sulla distribuzione e sull'accesso alle attività e ai servizi culturali offerti. Gli aspetti economici che si riversano sulla società sono connessi alla disponibilità di posti di lavoro, al contributo per le imprese locali dati dal potenziale attrattivo delle risorse culturali esistenti. Se si pone attenzione alla sempre più rilevante dimensione che definirei sociale, si individua prima di tutto un bisogno allo sviluppo di politiche attente al soddisfacimento di tali obiettivi. Aspetti legati alla valorizzazione di un territorio, in termini paesaggistici, interculturali, occupazionali, sono solo alcuni degli aspetti relativi e connessi al settore culturale che contribuiscono inevitabilmente al miglioramento della qualità della vita sul territorio, su un determinato territorio. Per esempio, per quanto concerne proprio la variabile del miglioramento della qualità della vita, si sta sviluppando tra gli studiosi e tra gli economisti soprattutto un movimento molto attento a considerare il benessere di un paese che va, come sapete bene, oltre i tradizionali meccanismi di valutazione. Il concetto, infatti, sotteso alla qualità della vita ha uno specifico significato se si considera che esso può essere utilizzato come valore che misura il benessere di individui, comunità e nazioni. Il concetto, il valore e l'impatto della qualità della vita stanno sempre più impegnando uno spazio fondamentale nel dibattito delle comunità scientifiche, alveo naturale dell'azione strategica del Ministero dell'Istruzione, per gli effetti che ne derivano sulla determinazione dei processi decisionali e nella allocazione appunto delle risorse finanziarie da parte dei decisori politici a qualunque livello di governo. Il tema è coerente con i paradigmi teorici che sono sottesi alla determinazione di un modello positivo di public governance e di indirizzo verso scelte responsabili delle pubbliche amministrazioni e soprattutto sostenibili nel lungo periodo. I beni culturali non possono non essere studiati anche rispetto al loro potenziale attrattivo. I flussi turistici nei territori sono influenzati dalla presenza dei beni culturali, come ben sapete. È importante osservare il fenomeno del turismo culturale basato sull'identificazione di mete turistiche. La consapevolezza acquisita si concretizza nella determinazione che per il settore dei beni culturali possa costituire un fattore attivo per la crescita socio-economica del territorio, di un determinato territorio, è un elemento cruciale per definire strategie volte a valorizzare i beni culturali stessi. Sostenibilità socio-economica, rilancio attraverso l'educazione e la ricerca e è anche restituzione o fruizione emotiva del patrimonio alle comunità di origine, non solo di monumenti, musei, beni materiali, siti archeologici e di tutto quanto rientra nell'ambito dei beni culturali, forse momentaneamente esclusi dal circuito per le dovute operazioni di ricerca, di restauro o di messa in offerta al pubblico, ma anche nel veicolare verso i cittadini quelle conoscenze detenute dagli addetti ai lavori. L'educazione e la ricerca, si pensi ai cantieri archeologici, per esempio, aperti agli studenti, come a un mix di educazione e ricerca, contribuiscono a rafforzare l'identità della comunità come pure quella individuale, ed in modo particolare penso al mondo dei giovani, consolida nelle coscienze la consapevolezza dell'importanza, in una società in continua trasformazione, e qui oggi parliamo dell'applicazione sostanzialmente delle nuove tecnologie digitali a settori che hanno proprio nella storia la loro forza, il loro punto di forza, quindi in una società in continua trasformazione come quella attuale, dell'impegno civico della tutela dei beni culturali. Restituzione, quindi, intesa come la necessità di accrescere le opportunità di conoscenza della cultura nell'accezione più ampia del termine, nel rispetto delle esigenze di tutela, ma con uno sguardo sempre rivolto alle future modalità di fruizione. E le tecnologie in questo appunto ci possono molto aiutare. Il principio della valorizzazione sostenibile permette di abbassare la soglia dell'accessibilità per ogni tipo di fruizione, garantendo però il valore scientifico di quanto presentato al pubblico attraverso proposte culturali articolate e continuative, con investimenti nel lungo periodo in ricerca ed educazione. In considerazione della pluralità dei soggetti coinvolti nella presa di decisioni riguardanti il settore, è essenziale, soprattutto in un contesto multilevel qual è il nostro, integrare le diverse azioni, lavorando in una logica di rete capace di sviluppare le necessarie sinergie tra scelte pubbliche. Basti pensare all'attività di un museo come il Museo Egizio, che è un organismo che ha nel Ministero dei Beni Culturali il suo punto di riferimento sia giuridico sia fattuale, e al tipo di coinvolgimento che c'è e ci potrebbero essere sempre di più in futuro, ne parlavamo prima con il direttore, per quanto concerne il coinvolgimento del Ministero. Per esempio, se si pensa, come io credo che sia auspicabile, una evoluzione della istituzione da lei presieduta verso una entità mista di ricerca e sostanzialmente appunto di museo, è un modello molto importante. E per fare una cosa di questo tipo, se noi ci atteniamo soltanto a un approccio di tipo burocratico giuridico, l'amico Lorenzo e la professoressa Barbati ci diranno che ci vogliono degli anni, dei secoli per farla, però se si guarda appunto all'obiettivo e si vede tutto in una logica di coordinamento tra soggetti che poi alla fine al cittadino importa poco se lo fa i beni culturali o lo fa la pubblica istruzione, interessa appunto il servizio. Quindi è questa nuova logica di governo delle istituzioni complesse in un sistema multilevel che occorre sempre di più privilegiare. Al territorio, quindi, in modo contestualizzato vanno indirizzate politiche educative e di ricerca, costruendo meccanismi di ingaggio con i differenti portatori di interessi. È acclarato che si amplia l'area degli spazi operativi comuni e che si richiede di elaborare politiche pubbliche tra loro coerenti. Vi è sicuramente una pluralità anche variegata di entità che con missioni politiche e attività differenti, tutela, salvaguardia, valorizzazione, appunto, eccetera, dall'interno o dall'esterno, in rete o singolarmente, possono essere player cruciali per la migliore utilizzazione dei beni culturali. L'attuazione di un modello di gestione innovativa non è che l'inizio di un ciclo virtuoso di riorientamento delle scelte pubbliche, attente alle opzioni di coinvolgimenti di tutti gli attori interessati. Fruire di un sito archeologico permette all'utente, al visitatore, al cittadino, alla comunità in generale di riappropriarsi di un passato molto spesso nascosto, ma non per questo meno prezioso. Fruire di un sito in corso d'opera, l'uso dei cosiddetti cantieri aperti, valorizzazione di tecnologie avanzate per la contribuzione alla riprogettazione di un sito, garantisce alla società tutta di sentirsi ingaggiata nei processi di tutela e valorizzazione del bene culturale, non sempre veloci e poco onerosi, e di comprendere e giustificare i costi di tempo, di risorse fisiche ed economiche, di gestione dell'ambiente sociale, della ricerca archeologica. Il MIUR può operare per una sorta di validazione tecnico-specialistica, l'efficacia e l'efficienza dell'offerta, circa le modalità con cui vengono allocate le risorse pubbliche nel settore dei beni culturali, anche al fine di sviluppare strumenti contestualizzati per favorire il processo di valorizzazione indiretta. È quindi necessario pensare alla programmazione degli interventi di istruzione e ricerca come a una scelta pubblica che valorizzi soprattutto l'approccio multidisciplinare, con inclusioni di competenze differenziate dal punto di vista tecnico, amministrativo, manageriale, quelle quali di archeologo, architetto, comunicatore, project manager e così via, con un approccio integrato di conoscenza, conservazione, fruizione e gestione del bene. Per chiudere, si vuole enfatizzare l'opportunità di promuovere il programma della Fondazione che oggi ci accoglie, pensando che nessun luogo è più vicino al popolo italiano del Mar Mediterraneo, oggi mainstream di quanto di più vicino a identità, alleanza e valori. Costruire un progetto, cioè, in cui il nostro Paese restituisce a studenti di altri Paesi che si affacciano sul Mediterraneo per diventare attori importanti alla valorizzazione culturale dei beni archeologici è una scelta preziosa per il bene comune dell'umanità, non solo dell'Italia, non solo dell'Europa. Grazie.
Grazie a Luigi Fiorentino. I would like to say to the students that the next days you'll have this speech in English also, so you will be able to read it. Okay, thanks. So, Lorenzo Casini, Head of the Ministry of Cultural Heritage, Activities and Tourism. Please, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Carla. I think I will do half and half, so I will speak Italian for the first, institutional part, and then when I have to address to the students, I will switch to English again. But the first question is, who are the students here in the room? Can you raise your hands so that I can identify you? Okay, so welcome. And what's your level of Italian, in understanding Italian? Nothing. Okay. So now that I will, okay. Now that I will,
you know Italian.
Okay. So now that I will switch to Italian, basically I can say whatever I wish, right? Ok, a little bit. Grazie, in italiano dirò poche cose. Quanto sono felice di essere qui in una delle scuole d'eccellenza del Ministero, che a volte non viene ricordato sufficientemente. L'Istituto per la Patologia del Libro, che siamo ben felici di tornare a chiamare così, insieme all'Opificio delle Pietre Dure e all'Istituto Centrale per il Restauro, che speriamo di riprendere a chiamare così, sono le tre istituzioni d'eccellenza in Italia e nel mondo per il restauro. Rilasciano anche il titolo di studio di laurea in restauro, che poi abilita la professione, e quindi credo che sia molto importante avere questo incontro qui oggi, proprio per avere una classe aperta di un'altra istituzione fortemente voluta dall'attuale ministro Franceschini, che era ministro allora, ossia quello di avere una scuola nazionale del Ministero, inteso come organo vigilante e finanziatore, che formasse le persone nel settore del patrimonio culturale. Io posso solo ricordare la difficoltà enorme che ci volle, perché era un momento in cui in realtà le scuole di formazione dentro la pubblica amministrazione venivano o soppresse o accorpate o cancellate. Quindi nonostante questo ci fu la forza, alla luce delle cose che ha detto prima Luigi Fiorentino, cioè della eccezionalità poi del patrimonio culturale, di raggiungere questo risultato. Aggiungo che iniziative come queste sono fondamentali, perché non va mai dimenticato che il Ministero per i beni e le attività culturali e per il turismo nasce dal Ministero della Pubblica Istruzione. Siamo una costola del Ministero della Pubblica Istruzione, soltanto nel 1974 ci fu la scissione, ma parliamo quindi dopo 100 anni che era presente un'amministrazione per il patrimonio storico-artistico, quindi in realtà rispetto al MIUR siamo ancora neanche a metà, diciamo, del percorso che abbiamo passato insieme, quello che il Ministero per la Cultura ha passato da solo, e quindi è inevitabile che ci siano punti di contatto e ci siano azioni comuni. Proprio per questo il Ministero, nella sua riorganizzazione del 2014, ha fortemente voluto una direzione generale educazione e ricerca, che mettesse l'educazione, la ricerca, la formazione al centro del progetto. Questo è lo spirito di qualsiasi riforma del patrimonio culturale: lo studio, la conoscenza, la ricerca, non la valorizzazione, che è un elemento che arriva alla fine di tutto il percorso. Purtroppo, come spesso avviene, è facile trovare un obiettivo contro cui concentrarsi e si dimentica tutto quello che viene prima, e cioè l'investimento in educazione, formazione, ricerca e la parola più importante su cui poggia il Ministero per i Beni Culturali, tutela. E quindi siamo al tema di oggi, e cioè come tutto questo si collega alla rivoluzione digitale. And now I switch to English so that hopefully the students will understand a bit what I'm going to say. The summary of what I just said is that how beautiful the Ministry for Cultural Heritage is. So basically you can summarize this. And how important is the connection between the Ministry for Cultural Heritage and the Ministry for Education. And how lucky you are in being part of the school of the ministry. So this is basically what I've said. Now, referring to the theme of digital revolution, I wanted to say just, I will try to express two main concepts. So one thing is why it's so important to address digital revolution, and why I do believe, and I'm quite sure that also Christian Greco believes, that not the only way, but the most effective way to address digital revolution is through humanism and is through the study and the knowledge of cultural heritage. So to the first issue, Luigi Fiorentino already highlighted many things. I want to add probably only two elements. The first one is that technology, digital revolution is changing not only our life. I mean, you see, if I have to tell you how many things I was able to do while sitting here using this, probably you won't believe that. But it's changing the very notion of institution. It's changing the very notion of states. How? I mean, think of the fact that the CEO of Facebook, Mark Zuckerberg, declared that Facebook is organized more like a government than a company. So basically, the power that GTEx companies are now exercising and the way in which they organize in themselves is similar to what institutions, public institutions, and government are. On the opposite, the organization of government and states is completely changing because of technology. I urge you to see what was the key element in anthropology and history to explain why states were born and why public institutions were born. The key element is writing. Writing. Now, technology is affecting the most important invention probably in our lives and the history of humanity. Writing is changing how we think and how we write. We don't even write anymore in many cases. So we use vocal WhatsApp, sometimes too long, I would say. But so this is something that we have to think about it. And now, in connection to this, I can highlight many other things like disinformation, fake news, algorithm in decision-making process. I mean, we are here with the Ministry for Education. I mean, an algorithm we use in order to decide where teachers should be located in Italy. So we have now a growing use of this kind of mechanism in the public decision-making. And you can just imagine how relevant this is for data protection and for protection of fundamental rights. I mean, how I can defend myself against an algorithm. So how can take an algorithm before a court? So what kind of argument I can use against an algorithm when I have to claim against this? So we are plenty of these problems, not only in Italy, but worldwide. And so I now go to the final part. So I'm really the last hurdle before you can listen to Christian, that is why cultural heritage, why humanism can be so useful, so important in order to address this problem. Many reasons. I will try to find just a few of them. One is that in order to face this problem, you need interdisciplinarity. You need to face with different disciplines, with different problems raised by different disciplines. And if there is a field where you can do this, it's cultural heritage. But there is another element. the importance of knowing and studying the context, because technology tries to make everything equal, and you are not able to recognize the origin, the context in which the problem raised. And the study of cultural heritage is based on the knowledge of history and context. So you're able to contextualize everything if you want to understand where it comes from, or how you can restore it, or how you can improve it. But finally, is the capacity of reading the different levels of knowledge. You need this. Otherwise, the result will be that whatever Wikipedia says is true. And this is not the case. I mean, studies now, there are studies, I don't believe in those studies, but studies say that the percentage of mistake of Wikipedia is less than the Britannica Encyclopedia. I cannot believe this, actually. I mean, but that's my empirical way, because I found so many mistakes in Wikipedia whenever I go there, so many, but I don't amend them. So I'm the first responsible for it, because I could amend them. Everybody could amend the mistakes in Wikipedia, but we don't do that. We see that there is a mistake, and then we go on. But in that moment, we become responsible for make people truly understand what is the real situation. So that's why I do believe that this kind of initiatives are crucial, not only for cultural heritage. They are crucial in order to have a better society. So, thank you very much.
Thanks, Lorenzo. In Italian first. Giusto per dirvi quanto realmente crede in ciò che ha detto Lorenzo, siamo reduci da un convegno di 3 giorni organizzato da lui come vicepresidente di ICONS, dedicato proprio alla intelligenza artificiale, digital revolution e regulation, democracy e così via, perché effettivamente i profili di interesse sono enormi, vastissimi. I was saying that he believes, Lorenzo believes in what he just said, because last week we had the 3 days Congress dedicated to digital revolution and the law, regulations, democracy, and he organized that Congress as vice president of ICONS, that's a public law worldwide organization. That's it. So thank you so much. And I will invite Christian Greco to join us. I mean, to come here. We can sit there and give his lecture. Please. Thanks, Christian.
So, good morning, everybody. Sabah al-khair, ahla wa sahlan fi Roma. And just a few words to say who I am. I'm Christian Greco, and I'm the Mudir al-Mataf al-Masri fi Turin. I direct Museo Egizio in Turin. I just wanted, for those of you who do not know the museum, I just wanted to show 2 slides, 4 actually, saying something about the museum and saying something about numbers, because I'm critical about numbers, but the ministry every year asks me about numbers. And this year I already told the Director General of Museums that when he will ask me, how many visitors did you have? I will answer 0. Even though the number of visitors is increasing, but I get so frustrated that this is the number that is asked and the number that is discussed about in the following days in the newspapers, without making comparisons which cannot be made, because they just take, for instance, starting with all Italian museums, say how many visitors they have. They don't look at the way you are financed, so the money that you can devote, for instance, for communication. My museum is actually self-sustained, is one of the, in the way we are self-sustained, we're the only example in Europe, which means that, for instance, I'm not the British Museum that can devote 4 million for communication overseas and to increase visitors. But I would like to say even more. What does it say how many visitors you have? Does it say anything about the kind of visit they had, whether they enjoyed, whether they learned something, whether we're willing to come back? And why don't they ask me, how many research projects do you have? That's why I put it up here, 19. 3 financed by the European Union. We had 3 archaeological awards. In 5 years, I came from having 1 curator to having 17 curators. I'm attracting curators from abroad. It's just the 3rd German that we are almost becoming a German-speaking curatorial staff. As you know, Germans are very far ahead in the philological study, especially in Oriental languages. And but since everybody asks about numbers, as a joke, I even put 270 mummies, because they always say, well, the Egyptian Museum is about mummies, and so I will try to demonstrate today that it's not only about mummies. What I really care about is that we have 50 memoranda of understanding with institutions abroad. We have 50 memoranda of understanding with the major universities, starting from Cairo University, going all the way to Oxford and Cambridge, MIT in Boston, Tokyo, and this is really the core. You have to know that last year we had 289 internships worldwide. The result of this is that 6 students wrote the master thesis on our cultural heritage, and 6 of them are continuing in their PhD and postdoc, and the museum is paying for that. We also have a worldwide program of touring exhibitions, which has resulted last year in different publications in different languages. This is very essential for us, first of all, budget-wise. When I arrived, we didn't have touring exhibition. Now is 1/10 of our budget. For us, it's essential for the conservation and research. It's also essential because we get to get the Museo Egizio known worldwide. I was lecturing in Georgetown University once, and I gave a public lecture in Washington. And a lady came up to me and she said, well, it's so amazing what you showed about the exhibition. I must say, this is the best hidden Italian treasure. I don't want it to be hidden. I want it to be known, because we have one of the most important collection in the world of Egyptian antiquities, and Italy has, on one hand, the burden to take care of it and the honor to take care of it, and to make it understand that this cultural heritage, which is now Italian by law, but it belongs to the world, because Egyptology is one of the most international disciplines we have. Let's come now to Turin. This is a beautiful building that houses our museum. It's in the center of Turin. It's a wonderful Baroque building. You can see that it was started in the 17th century. It was started not as being a museum, but it was started as being a boarding school for families so students could come to study there. It developed in the 18th century in becoming the seat of the Academy of Science, and part of the building is still the seat of the Academy of Science. And when the collection arrived in 1824, it has been housing ever since the museum. It was nice to listen to what Lorenzo said concerning also safeguarding cultural heritage, because the Egyptian collection arrived in 1824. In 1832, the collections of the university, where there were Roman antiquities, were merged with the Egyptian antiquities, with the ideas. We didn't need to have classical statues anymore at university, but they should be merged with a major collection. The museum became, in 1832, Museum of Antiquities and Egyptians, and since 1930, and from that time, for more than 100 years, till 1939, it was the place that ruled safeguarding of the territory and cultural heritage in Turin, Piedmont, Liguria, and Val d'Aosta. The director of the Museo Egizio was at the same time superintendent and was excavating in an amazing way in Piedmont and in Egypt, applying exactly the same rules and developing in Egypt new stratigraphic technique. I just quote one person, Barrocelli, who was a personal assistant of Schiaparelli in Egypt, and he was diverted from Egyptology because his help was very well needed in Turin to excavate the theater, in Aosta to excavate the theater. And I say that because after 1939, the Ministry of Education kind of forgot that, and we have been defined ever since as extraterritorial museum. There was a superintendence, a special superintendence to the Museo Egizio, which was extraterritorial, as if we don't have a territory. And I will show you how now we can link us back to the territory, to Egypt to start with. But let me come finally in medias res. What is digital revolution and how can a museum deal with that? In order to understand and to make a comparison, I was glad to hear Professor Casini talking about writing, because I want to go back to writing, and I want to go back to the 5th century BC and to Socrates. Let me read you some passages of the Fighters of Socrates. Here's Socrates speaking, well, in the wording that Plato gives to us. Writing, Phaedrus, has this strange quality and is very like painting. For the creatures of painting stand like living beings, but if one asks them a question, they preserve a solemn silence. And so it is with written words. You might think they spoke as if they had intelligence, but if you question them, wishing to know about their sayings, they always say only one and the same thing. This is, of course, the major critic that Socrates has against writing, because while using oral questioning, he could adjust his questions to the answer that the one with whom he was in dialogue would give. Writing is static and it remains silence. But then he goes on and he says, and every word, when once it is written, is bandied about, alike among those who understand and those who have no interest in it. And it knows not to whom to speak and not to speak. When ill-treated or unjustly reviled, it always needs its father to help it, for it has no power to protect or help itself. And I wanted to start here because there are two major points of interest in my ideas. First of all, the comparison is quite obvious. In the 5th century BC, we had a major transformation of society, going from an oral tradition to a written tradition. They changed everything. They changed the way of learning. They changed the way of interacting with people. As you read Homer, you know that people were used to be able to learn by heart 48 books of the Iliad and the Odyssey, and the structure was as such so that you can exercise your memory in doing that. When we go to writing, we devote our energy to other activities because we don't need to memorize all of that. And of course, for Socrates, it was also a different way of communicating, because when you could not adjust anymore, once you write, it's valid for everyone. But we know that Socrates lost the battle. He was so against writing, but he's one of the philosophers from the ancient worlds, thanks to Plato, Aristotle, and Xenophon, of whom we have the most written words preserved. But he says also something else that I would like to compare to cultural heritage. He says that cultural heritage can be ill-treated, that it cannot help itself, it has no power to protect or to help itself. And here I think now, maybe is a moment where cultural heritage, for major part of the society, risks to be silenced. The recent Oxford numbers are not good for the fruition of museums in Italy. 26% of people are said to go to a museum once a year, against more than 90% in Scandinavian country. There is something that for somebody, when I read these numbers, for somebody who runs museum, there is a question that comes up to my mind. Why? What do we do wrong? And how can we find a way to connect the cultural heritage to the people, to make people understand that a museum is not a suspended society, a museum is in society, so it responds to all the needs of society, and the cultural heritage belongs to each one of us. Well, in Italy, it's quite clear, because it is even written in our constitution, in Article 9 of our constitution, preserving cultural heritage. In the first part, it says that the Republic safeguards cultural heritage and technical and scientific research. So research can be an answer, it should be an answer, but how do we communicate it? How can we connect? And I think that the answer is in archaeology and in anthropology, going back to a concept that anthropologists have been studying about since at least 40 years, which is the concept of the biography of the object. In a museum, we have objects, and we have to convey the message that each object has a biography, like we have. When we talk about an archaeological object, we talk about many different lives. An object was invented, created in function in antiquity. It was then forgotten, we could say it died. It was rediscovered thanks to archaeological excavation and collecting, and it came in a museum. And in a museum, it has a new life. All these life have to be studied. And it is important also to convey the message that we are interested about objects because, well, Lorenzo was already saying that, because we have this very strange relationship with objects. We think that we create objects, but we don't understand how much we are created by objects. A very important colleague of mine, Professor Malafouris from the University of Athens, had said that he started making comparison and study about how a blind person goes around having a white stick and saying, where does the person end? At the end of the hand or at the end of the stick? And then even Hegel, already in 1817, in the Phenomenology of the Spirit, said that there is a very strict interconnection between material culture and human beings. Think about, even in the most abstract form of thought that we think we have, which is arithmetic and mathematical thought, is not possible without material culture. It was developed in Mesopotamia and in Egypt thanks to writing. Without writing, we cannot have complex mathematical thought. And nowadays, we think we are so modern, but without these machines, without the object that we have created, we are not able to develop algorithms, we are not able to develop mathematical thought, we are not able to develop our own way of thinking. So the relation between us and objects is very strict, and also we create the object, we think we have possession of the object, but the objects very often have a much longer life than we have. They survive generations, and then when we go into archaeology, the object is the only thing we have to reconstruct the life of the ancients. Professor Asman, one of the most important living Egyptologists, said that objects are scattered memories, is what we live. How can we convey this message to the public? Well, I will show you what we're doing now at the Museo Egizio. The idea came to me to one of the most beautiful archaeological museums I have visited in my life, which is the Nordiska Museum in Stockholm, which I call the Museum of True Democracy, where they show in a very pregnant way how the material culture and people are connected. I'll give you one example. For those of you who are archaeologists, we always read in the literature that pots are not people, that we have to be very careful when we make an analysis of pottery to say that if we sign a class of pots, it corresponds with an ethnicity. Well, we all know that, but how do you convey that to the public in general? So you go to Stockholm and you see a wonderful room, I think twice as big as this, with nice spearheads and all the classification from the 6th millennium BC till the end of prehistory. And they say where they come from. So you are very impressed. But then you go to a following room and the room is almost empty, because then the director was very brave to say, you thought in the previous room that we had a great collection, but actually we have gaps. We have much more gaps than the objects that we have. And the collection says much more about those who were excavating than the real truth. But then you go to a third room and you're completely shocked, because there you see toothbrushes, brushes to wash your dishes, and brushes to clean your toilet. From 1952, in Sweden till now, from the north of Sweden to the south. And then they say, could you classify Swedish population according to that? And then it's immediately clear that pots are not people. And inspired by that, since I wanted to talk about the biography of the objects, I have a room now where people see these kind of objects. So the first thought is Greco must have gone nuts, because why in an Egyptian museum you show things like this? And these are objects that belong to the employees of the museum, and next to each object there is a little story that connects that employee to the object. And actually what we come to say that the objects are witness to our life, and those are the people who lived before us, whether they're artistic creation or everyday things, ancient finds or items from our childhood. Objects act as a bridge connecting those who produced them with those who observe them and question them today. And so we have this kind of objects. As a museum person, I'm always very interested not only on what is exhibited, but how people interact. And it's very interesting because people at first are shocked, but then something else comes about. If the objects are in a showcase, they must be important. So they start questioning themselves why they're in the showcase, which is something that we have to remember. Because when we put a coffin in a showcase, we are doing interpretation already. A museum doesn't do interpretation only writing labels, or writing books, or writing panels. When you choose to put an object in a showcase, when you choose a grouping of objects, you are already interpreting reality. And when you put a coffin in a showcase, you are interpreting a lot, because you are conveying the message that that is an object of art, not that it was a ritual, sacred object, essential in a major part of the ancient Egyptian religion. So, the museum has the task to tackle one of the fundamental problems. What is the relationship, which in anthropology is known as relationship between subject and object? And we can do it with those objects. But what is nice, with those objects, we have still the memories. So we have the written words and the oral tradition that help us to reconstruct their biography and the biography of the people they belong to. But with archaeological objects, sometimes, even if I have to talk about a pharaoh of the ancient past, I have much less than this. So that's very important also to understand what an archaeologist has to do. And nothing is possible without research. And I define here research as the most profound and refined form of study that a museum has, and as a form of listening and looking at the objects. A museum doesn't have a choice to do or not to do research. A museum without research does not exist. It's not a museum. It's a showcase, it's a storeroom. A museum is something else. Without research, a museum does not exist. So let me bring you inside in the first life of the objects. And I use the Museo Egizio as a key of explanation, but it can be applied to many different museums. First of all, we tend to forget that a museum is not only objects. A museum is archive. A museum is intangible cultural heritage as well, which we forget a lot. Because we think that if some of the collection is published, then it's enough. But how much knowledge there is in our curators, how much knowledge which is passed on by generation and generation and is the connection with the objects in many different ways. And a lot of those information very often are not in published book. Every publication is a synthesis. All the analytical work that you do constantly, daily, in your connection with the objects is something that should be considered as well. And what about the archive and the libraries? We have one of the most important ancient archives. We have 39 linear meters of archaeological archive and 14,000 unpublished glass negatives. That shows these beautiful images. We are from 1903 till 1927, the period when the Italian archaeological mission in Egypt was founded, and when Schiaparelli and his team, and I would like to say his Egyptian team, starting with Bolos Gatta, and those who were working with them, that Stephen Kirk defined the hidden hands, because very often those workmen are only seen as part of the landscape, but those workmen are the one who did archaeology. Of course, Schiaparelli was there, but those were excavating. Without them, we wouldn't have our museum. Without Bolos Gatta here, we wouldn't have the beautiful statue of Pendua of Nefertari, which is now in a museum. It is a duty of the museum also to give a name to those hidden hands. And with the archive, we can do that because we have the list of the workmen, we have the name of the workmen, we know how much they were paying, we know in the letters how they were reacting with the Italian colleagues, and we have to rewrite the history of archaeology, which has been Europe-centered way too much, and we should also go into those connections. At that time already, there was a huge use of photograph. Schiaparelli was quite obsessive with that. His brother was a photographer himself, founded a society of photography in Piedmont, and he used photography constantly, which is a blessing because unfortunately he did not publish as much as he should have. You see, he was photographing everything, even the moment of creating, the moment of transportation. And it's very interesting talking about revolution, technological revolution, that in 1838, François Arago announced at the Académie in Paris that daguerreotypie was invented. And the first connection he made was with archaeology and with Egypt. He said, give now one or two of these machines to l'Institut d'Egypte, and they will document the thousands and thousands of hieroglyphs which are on the monuments. And making pictures at that time was not that easy. It took 45 minutes or 1 hour and a half to stand still and document, and then you had to develop the photographs. Schiaparelli in one letter writes that all his fingers are completely blackened by silver natrium, and he cannot wash his hands anymore, and also thinks about all what he had to breed, of course, in doing the development. And there was a major problem. Photography was in black and white. So when in 1904 the tomb of Nefertari was discovered, he had to send a painter to paint on the photography to give the colors. Well, but nowadays we decided, to go back to the ground. Of course, we have the archive, but then I wanted to stop to be considered the Museum of Antiquities. In the name, there is also the foundation of the Museum of Egyptian Antiquity, which is wrong, by the way, because in 1939, we were the museum, till 1939, of antiquities and Egyptians, and then the name Antiquities remained, but we are an archaeological museum. So I wanted, and I'm trying hard, to have in the Museo Egizio part of the archaeological discourse in Italy, because we have always been considered the other thing, strange things, exotic oriental things coming from Egypt. We have an archaeological museum. So for me, the first step was to go back to the field. The museum was not excavating for more than 40 years, and we have to be back in the field to connect our objects, first of all, to the remains there. Very often we have statues and stele that comes from the ground, but we don't know exactly from where. And to connect with the society, because we have a huge responsibility also within Egyptian society, and we are developing a program of public archaeology so that we can talk about our collections and the importance of that in the village, for instance, in Saqqara. But then there is the need of documentation. We have a strict cooperation with the Polytechnic of Milan, where we developed this method of photogrammetry. Documenting, not using drones, that, as you know, it's not allowed in archaeological site, but documenting by photographing square centimeter by square centimeter, so that every inch is documented and every object is documented, so that you can do a cloud. From the cloud you can do a mathematical model, and then you could do a 3D printing. But this is not enough, because isolating the object is actually what museums do. Professor Carandini, one of the most important archaeological professors of archaeology in Italy, wrote in his book, The Force of the Context, that a museum should be abolished. Of course, it's a provocation, but then he says a museum, of course, separates completely the object from the archaeological context and from the landscape. That's why we want to put the flask that you see in the embalming cache, and see, of course, those of you who have been excavating in Egypt knows exactly when you see that the sand changed colors and from yellow becomes a little bit brownish and black, you know that you're in an archaeological context. And just outside the tombs, we found this concentration of sherds, and then we know, because they are all around the shaft, that those are embalming cache. All the embalming caches, all the fragments of the sherds that we're using during mummification, and then have to be preserved because somehow they were sacred. In the meantime, we wanted, because we do photogrammetry, the precision that you see here is sub-millimetrical. So it's as if you are in Saqqara now, with a precision. By the way, everything is geo-positioned, because we take all the points, of course, with the total station, and we wanted to show to our public in a museum, because how can you show an excavation in a museum? How can you justify to the public that a museum, so we can all agree that a museum has to be a research institution, but then remains a huge question. Why do we talk about research in our journals, in our monographs, in our congresses, among colleagues, but not with the public? Who are we to say that the public should not be part of research? That's why I wanted so much to find a way to show the excavation to my public, to tell to the public of the museum that there is a reason why we go to Egypt. There is a reason why we spend money and energy, and we send people for 8 weeks to Egypt, and that the results belong to everybody. That's why we did this model, where we try to convey also some different messages. For instance, that archaeology is the most destructive human activities that we can think of. An archaeologist is not an architect. We don't build, we destroy. If I want to be less pessimistic, I can say we deconstruct to reconstruct a history. But if we don't document, we destroy everything. That's the first thing I did. Is a little tiny thing. In 2015, I became a director, co-director of the excavations, which is in cooperation with the Leiden University and the Leiden Museum of National Antiquities, and I changed the name of the mission. It's not anymore the mission to the New Kingdom necropolis, but it's the mission to the necropolis of Saqqara. It seems something strange, but it's a completely different. If I say New Kingdom, it means we are interested in New Kingdom tombs, and whatever there is after that, you know, well, it's in our step, and whatever is after that is a lot. You see these white features. These are Ramesside chapels, which were built starting from the time of Ramses II. They belong to priests of Ptah. In the titles, we find very often Emhat and Ptah in the front part of Ptah. There were priests who were carrying around the bark of Ptah during the processions. But here we see how the stratigraphy is complex. What you see in red is the 12th and 11th century BC. Yellow is the 7th, 4th century BC. Blue is, we are in the late antiquities, and we are in the 4th to 6th century AD. Within 1.5 meters, we go to the 6th century AD to the Christianization of Egypt. There we see the housing of Copts, we know, of course, because there was the monastery of Papa Jeremias nearby. We see the domestic feature of those Anachoretes who wanted to live in the desert and to be separated by the rest. Then in the yellow, we found the caches of the late period, where they didn't have money and energy to build tombs. And in the red one is those chapel of the Ramesside period. Well, of course, and I wanted to show also my public how double the tombs are, because you have the chapel, of course, functioning for the community of the living, where you bring offerings, but then you have the under-burial chamber. And I wanted to show what it is excavating. So we documented our shaft, which we excavated 2 years ago, that goes down for 4.30 meters. And when you go down, then you have two chambers, one that opens in the west and that one that opens in the east. And when we went down, we looked up and we saw that everything was black, and it was clear that we were not the first one, because somebody had been there before us and put fire, and so we know that the mummy was plundered the room was plundered in antiquities, because in antiquity people who go inside the necropolis, not be interested, of course, on having pieces of objects to sell in the antiquity market, but interested in gold and precious stones, as you all know, from the famous robbery papyrus preserved in the British Museum. Well, if we think of the life of an object, ancient objects, there are simple questions that we have to address and that we have to try to convey to the public. And those questions are what, where, when. So that at the end we can say, what? I didn't know that. So what is it? Where was it done and where was it found? When was it done and where was it found? And what, which is what we can express at the end. Let me go to you into details. How can you do all this process? You can document the object. You can, for instance, do macro XRF mapping of what you have, and then you can see what kind of pigments you have, and all in a sudden you discover something very interesting. You discover in this box, coming from the tomb of Ka, that you have some black manganese, which we were not expecting. And then in analyzing the details, we found out that it was used by the master artist who with manganese corrected the hieroglyphs and made some details. So all in a sudden we can distinguish two hands. As you know, Egyptian artists would not sign themselves. So it's quite interesting to do so. And then there are moments when we say that the researcher should be humble. And I want to show you this example. We should all remember when we work in cultural heritage that we can be useful to cultural heritage, but we are only one of the passers-by. We go by the cultural heritage. The Egyptian collections in the Museo Egizio has an average life of 3,500 years. The period time that I will take care of that is nothing. My role is zero. The collection is important. And I give you an example. And also I have to understand that also our research seen in this chronology is nothing. If I want to be in Nature tomorrow, I have to, in Nature I mean the journal, the very famous journal, to have an article published there. I have the perfect opportunity. I have this box containing 7 alabaster containers which have inside the 7 sacred oils. You know how important they were, the 7 sacred oils in ancient Egypt, for embalming, for the ritual of the opening of the mouth, and we don't know their composition. Nowadays, in doing analysis in the carbon atoms and to see how they decayed, we could see what is the fat contained inside and reconstruct the oils. Well, in doing that, I would have to destroy the cover. So what I did up to now was a non-invasive analysis with the synchrotron. We were kindly housed by our colleagues in the Oxfordshire. We did analysis, and now we see that there is oil inside. And actually, the jar is quite full. But there is a problem. The jar is covered by a jar stop in clay. then there is metal, then there is textiles, and then there is alabaster, and very often there is even the seal with the name of Amenophis II. Who am I to take it out and to make analysis on that? And there will be a day, maybe in 200 years from now, when you can look inside without making any problems. And then is the moment where I have to be humble and remember, don't think you are too important. You have to take care of this collection and giving it to the coming generation. This collection exists since 3,500 years. The same question sometimes, and it's a difficult question, I know, and we could discuss it about hours, applies also on excavations. How often now we should say we do not excavate this site? It's better preserved if we don't do that. Also remembering that the techniques and the technologies that we have nowadays, of course we think it is up to date, but what do we know? What we'll be able to do in 200 years? It's so important when we read, we reread about excavation. For instance, 1891, Grebeau and Darezi, Mohammed Abdel Rasoul calls Grebeau Secretary General of the Service of Antiquities and Darezi to excavate the so-called second kasher of Deir al-Bahri. 660 part of coffins, 2/3 of the coffins that we have from the third intermediate period. They excavated that in 5 days. When I read that, I feel pain in my heart and I say, how much I wish this thing could happen today, where we would be so careful. But what we think is careful today, in 200 years, of course, we will have many criticisms, and we have to be aware of that. And the stratigraphy is not infinite. So sometimes we should also say, we have investigated part of the necropolis, we stop, and we leave it for the coming generations. I want to show you, well, first, a little things, how sometimes analysis in ancient material and culture can lead to amazing results in modern technology. We are studying our pigments, and especially Egyptian blue, with the MIT in Boston, that, as you know, is since years the best university in all ranking worldwide. We are studying Egyptian blue, the composition, by a professor in Boston, Massachusetts Institute of Technology, who has a full professorship in materiality and technology of archaeological material. And what is he studying? The composition, but the application nowadays. So, for instance, it turns out that Egyptian blue is would be the best material that you could use to have prostheses in osteological operations, and it would be much more efficient for solar panel than what we use nowadays. Now, he's developing the research, and I told him, of course, if you arrive at the result, the Museo Egizio wants to have his share, since we have a commercial share, since we helped you so much. But there is a link that you would never think of. But I want to go back to the humbleness of the researcher. On the 15th of February 1906, the Egyptian among you for sure know that, Ernesto Schiaparelli and the Italian Archaeological Mission discovered in Deir Medina the tomb of Ra. 467 objects, a few remained in Cairo, the majority arrived in Turin, among which mummies. Schiaparelli wrote in a letter to his mum, while it was completely normal at that time to unwrap the mummy, that he would not do that, because he said there will be a day when we can look inside the mummy without destroying them. Think what had happened in Cairo a few years before, 1891, the first cachette of Deir al-Bahri. We have this beautiful painting of Philippe Poteau, and we see these European travelers going to Cairo, and all the mummies of Deir al-Bahri being unwrapped, with the result that have been detached from their coffins, and we have lost the human remains. In Turin, this did not happen. I don't want to show it now. Yeah, let me try to show it right now. And the mummy of Ra is still intact. It's amazing to know that more than 100 years ago, Schiaparelli said there will be a time when we will be able to look inside the mummy without destroying them. In 1906, he could not know that we would develop X-ray, CT scans, and do virtual unwrapping. But that's what you're going to see in a minute. those who have been excavating that mummy never saw it. And in a museum which is very rich of material, but is completely poor in gold and jewels, because in Turin we have almost nothing. Even very small museums have more jewelry than we had. The director of the museum and the director of the archaeological excavation never knew that inside the mummy of Ka looked like this. As you see, it's not very well preserved. It's on a skeletal form. Only on the back there is some of the skin which is preserved. But what really strikes us immediately are those jewels. Jewels disposed according to Book of the Dead chapter 156, respecting the rituality. But those of you who are Egyptology will notice immediately that around the neck it has this color. This color is the shebiu color, or the gold of honor, which the pharaoh would give to the most important officials. You see also that he has a necklace, and at the end of the necklace you have the heart scarab. Heart scarab probably inscribed with Book of the Dead chapter 30a or 30b, and all the jewels around. What is interesting is that shebiu, the gold of honor, is probably one of the very few archaeological attestations that we have, because we know it from reliefs, we know it from statues, but we don't know it from the actual object. And nowadays, we are able to do a 3D modeling, and we will be able, in the near future, to do a 3D printing. We already did a 3D printing I will show you. It's not satisfactory, in the sense it doesn't convey really the image and the details we would like to have, but it gives us an impression of what we will be able to do. And this is also an impression of how you have to keep intact the cultural heritage, and how you do not know what in years from now things could change and could develop. Of course, there are a lot of interesting information about paleopathological information. We know about his arthrosis. We know he has the so-called tennis player syndrome, not because he was playing tennis, of course. We know his title was Imi Erkaut Nesut, responsible of the works of the pharaoh, and he was working himself. And look at this. Since we published that, the fact that his brains is intact, his organs are still inside, all universities worldwide, from Sydney to Los Angeles, are asking me whether we can have samples of the brain of Ra. And the answer is, of course, no. There is no way we will have a destructive analysis on the brain. And I tell them, maybe one day we could do virtual endoscopy and look inside. It's very interesting, by the way, that he still has the organs, because we know that Herodotus says there are different types of mummification. He says mummies who belong to the very lower economical level were not eviscerated and were not excerebrated. But it's not the case of Ra. And in this chronology is quite peculiar and quite interesting. The chronology is 1350 BC. I just want to show you a few images of his wife, Merit. She was buried in the same burial chamber. There is a little riddle concerning the wife, because her Book of the Dead papyrus is in La Bibliothèque Nationale in Paris since 1880, more or less, which is quite interesting, because the tomb was discovered in 1906. So the papyrus must have been given to one of her children, because, of course, the papyrus was not in the tomb, and the tomb was intact. I just want to show you a few images of her unwrapping. By the way, the unwrapping seems so easy, but it's not. We have been studying for 3 years the way of doing that in cooperation with the British Museum, because you have to study an algorithm, as it were, excavating the mummy. And we discovered something amazing. She has a wig, a second wig, because in the museum, in the public display, we have a wig, and we didn't know she had a second wig. Now, when you see the images, you see that the wig doesn't continue don't be tricked, that is only the way we read the images. It's because of the emission of the color. This was a color in gold, so you see the image detached, but actually the wig was going down. And we didn't know she had it, and we didn't know she had these beautiful jewels. So when we started doing 3D modeling, and we did it some 3D printing. As I said, they give an image, but they're not as satisfactory as we would like to, because, well, they're printed in resin, hot resin. When the resin comes out, it drops on another drop of resin, and then you have all kind of little imperfections that added one to another give just this result. And also the initial model does not give us all the details. We are concerning whether we should use now an industrial CT scan for the metals and hard scarab, for instance. But even on that, one has to be very careful, because industrial CT scan could influence the biological tissue, and so we need to work with forensic doctors and biologists to be sure that if we use that, we don't provoke any alteration to the biology of the mummy itself. We are in cooperation with Professor Salima Ikram of the American University in Cairo, writing a full catalog, very awaited catalog of all our mummies, animal mummies. And we have one of the most important collections. The interesting thing is that at least in 53 examples, we were able to take samples from the textiles and from the skin of the animal in order to date them. Because when you go to an Egyptian museum worldwide and you look at animal mummies, very often you see late period, and then underneath is written 1712, 1331 BC. In other words, we don't know, because when you give a 7th century of datation, means that you don't know. You have to know the Egyptologists normally, when they doubt about something is late period, when they really, really doubt is Greco-Roman period. So don't trust Egyptologists. But here we have the chance to help and to try to make a better classification, typology, and link to a date. It's also interesting because in doing CT scan, we are discovering how many fake mummies we have, or mummies who actually inside look completely different from what we have. Like this crocodile, which is 1.19 meters long, but when we did a CT scan, it has only a little crocodile in the fore part. Why did they do that? Well, I like to think that the ancient Egyptians were, of course, as pragmatic as we were, as we are. And so, of course, they wanted to bring a nice ex-voto to the god Sobek, that people would look, and we noticed, by the way, that the poorer the remains are inside, the richer is the wrapping. So actually you give the impression to the god, but especially to the people around, that you were so pious, but you saved money. We discovered that in 2 apis bull that we have, where we only have vertebrae and ribs, in falcons, we have many falcons only with 1 feather and not falcon at all. And in this, I even had some troubles with the police at customs. I was bringing back an exhibition from Japan, and I was stopped at customs. I was at the time working in the Netherlands, and then the following day, my secretary called me and told me, could you come down because there is the custom police looking for you. And I said, well, ask them to come up to my office. And they told me they were very serious, and they told me, you have imported illegally mummies from Japan. And I was shocked. I said, no, I'm working from the Kingdom of the Netherlands, and I brought back their collections. But as you know, when you bring animal mummies back, you have to have of the paperwork attesting that those, what kind of animals they are, and that they can be imported. And they said, no, you only asked for 1 falcon, but you have 3. And then I just took out the CT scans, and I said, well, look, 1 is complete, the other is only a feather. So they relaxed on that. But then I had a very big problem, because I had a package containing remains of snakes. And Salima Ikram had identified one of these snakes with a species which I don't remember which one it was, which the importation of which is absolutely forbidden in the European Union. So this custom police told me, you have to have a document where it is attested that this snake was born in captivity. And I couldn't believe that. So I told him, well, I will ask Ptolemy II. And then he didn't understand me. And I told him, do you know the date of those mummies? And he said, no. And I told him, it's 3rd century BC. And he said, oh, well, way before the European law. I said, yes. So then I realized I was not attested. It's interesting, and I look at the law professor, that for human mummies, nobody cares. For animal mummies, there is a problem, but for human mummies, they do not care. Technology allows us to discover interesting things about mummies, and also in our, I want to show you just one example of one of our cat mummies. We have many cats. With the cats, we can also do virtual unwrapping. And I just want to show you one example where our vet and our radiologist and the Egyptologist do not agree. And we do not have the solution yet, because the solution would be, again, do some kind of invasive analysis, which you have understood I do not allow. So there is this cat. Is 2 years old. It was wrapped, quite well preserved. The linen is in good conditions. Everything is standard. The shape is standard, but look at the eye sockets. It has these two blue points. And of course, when we saw that, we say, well, of course, those are stones. But the radiologist said it's impossible. The emissions they give is not of stones. It has to be of organic material. I mean, we say it's impossible that are the eyes. And he said, well, maybe the eyes preserved with something. We find it very difficult to believe. But this is one of the many questions we have. I want to go a little bit quick to this. And I like to talk about papyrus at this institute. And I like to show you something about papyri, which I'm not proud of, which we have in Turin. Up to now, we are the only Egyptian collection. I asked Dr. Sabah in the museum in Cairo to see whether she has some example. I asked Professor Dr. Seifried in Berlin, Neil Spencer in London, Vincent Rondeau in Paris. Nobody has this. I repeat, not something I'm proud of. Starting from the beginning. We had this papyrus representing an amduat, the so-called Kurzfassung, as Professor Niewinski defined it, so a summary version of the amduat. For those of you who do not know, the amduat is a cosmographic book of the New Kingdom, representing the journey of the solar god in the hereafter for the 12 hours at night. Why is this not particularly important? It's a papyrus of the 8th century BC. It's a very summarized papyrus, not of a particularly good hand. But anyway, we could see, just looking at the surface, that there are differences in the colors. You see there are parts which are quite dark and parts which are lighter. And we were thinking, what has happened there? Where we're using paraloid during the conservation. And of course, the thing we should do is look at the back of the papyrus and see how it was preserved. But all our papyri in the 20th century and be restored in gluing the papyrus into textiles and then gluing the textiles into a paper support. If we can quite easily detach the paper support, the textile is quite more difficult. Sometimes it's completely intertwined with the fibers of the papyrus itself. And we cannot use any kind of solvents, of course, because we have to preserve the ink. We managed, in a cooperation with our conservators and the university, to find a way to take out, in this particular case, the textiles, and then we could look at the rector. And the result was this. On the back, there is a patchwork of papyri. When the papyrus arrived in Turin, they decided to fill in the gaps with fragments of papyri we have 26 fragments of unpublished papyri, and they thought, okay, we can use these fragments. The result is that what you see here in the back is much more important than what you see in the front. These are Ramesside letters from Deir el-Medina from 1250 BC, while the other is a very common repetitive papyrus of the 8th century BC. What can we do now? Well, of course, nothing. No way that I'm going to detach these fragments. So this is also part of the biography of the object, but we can document little by little this fragment, and we can virtually reconstruct the papyri. And we did it at print just to make it visible the way it is. In cooperation with the University Roma La Sapienza, and thanks to an ICRC grant, we are studying the inks of our Coptic deposit. We have one of the most important Coptic library. We have amazing documents in the museum, and we are also studying the materiality and see how they were produced. I want to go a little bit quick on the textile, because I've seen that I've been talking a lot already, so let me go to the last objects I want to present, which is a coffin. A very important coffin, a coffin belonging to Buti Amun. Buti Amun lived at the time of Ramses XI. It's debated among Egyptologists whether he is the one who abandoned the city of Deir el-Medina and went to the temple of Medinet Habu. We know for sure that he was, he had a task from the pharaoh, from the high priest of Amun, to do a vehem keres, to go around the necropolis, to take the coffins and to put them in safety in a moment where the necropolis was plundered. His coffins is quite interesting because it's on the way, on the passage line between the New Kingdom coffins to what we call the so-called yellow coffins of the Third Intermediate Period. We have done analysis on the coffins. The Museo Egizio joined the Vatican in the so-called Vatican Coffin Project, and all the analysis we did are now joined in a video that I want to show you, where we try to convey all information to what we know and also to what we don't know, and to determine how research in the near future should be implemented. So, what we did, we asked the Polytechnic of Milan to come to Turin and to document. They tried a new CT scan and a laser scanner to do a 3D model of the coffin. The 3D model, again, has a sub-millimetric precision, and not only of the shape, but also of the decoration which is on the coffin itself. So we do a micro-mapping, and we project on the coffin the decoration. But this, for me, was not enough. I wanted the coffin to have all the information, so that's why I put the X-rays and I put a CT scan to have in this model all of the information we have. And all in a sudden, we saw this. The coffin is composed of 30 different elements, of 30 different pieces of previous coffins which have been reused. And when you do imaging analysis, you see that there is different kind of opacity, and this opacity is due to the fact that there is a lot of clay used to patch together the wood. And so when you look inside at the different features, you see that underneath the chin there was a hole which was now closed from the beard, where the beard was coming out. That the hands were two stretched hands, and now there are 2 fists, which is a gender differentiation, because 2 fists are typical of a man, 2 hands are typical of a woman. That there are parts in the coffin where we find different kind of colors. Like here, we find these 2 black spots, which are what remains of a previous coffins of the beginning of the 18th century, 18th dynasty, 600 years before, where the coffin were blackened with bitumen. We have 2 on the side and 2 on the back, and we have also pieces of wood that patch together all this patchwork of wood. And when we look at the base, we see that the base is way too small to fit within the coffin, and there was a framework put around it in order to have it fit. And so all in a sudden the coffin becomes something much more complex. It is wood, and on wood we have clay, and on clay we have textile, and on textiles we have huntite and calcite, and on that was a drawing of the artist made in red. And then the colors were applied, started with ochre, and when black was applied, and then green and blue, and then orpiment, this pigment made on basic of arsenicum, and this is the final shape. But now that we have a look inside and we have found all these kind of questions, we might say we have the solution. But we do realize now, and all these little words say that now we have many more questions. How is it possible that the coffins was made of reused coffins? Was it admitted and legitimate to the one who had the task to put in safety the coffins, in the meantime to reuse the coffins? Was he himself doing that? Or you would choose the coffin like this in the workshop? But was the coffin then, if the coffin could be reused, was it still considered per and jet, house of eternity? Or maybe this house of eternity was confined to the ritual of the opening of the mouth? And what about the workshops? Where would you go? How would you choose them? What was their technology? When we take out the pigment, we can define the typology. But how were we working? What was your capacity of decision left to the personality and to what you believed? How many questions actually we have now that we do not answer? The technology is not the final answer, but it's the way to convey more questions. Now that we understand materiality, we have more questions to ask ourselves. And I want you to read this final text. O noble coffin of the singer of diamond Lectio, rest inside you. Convey to her my message because you're near her, and ask her, how are you? How are things? And this makes everything even more complicated. This is an ostracon preserved at the Louvre. Butte-Amon misses his wife, who died before him. And what does he do? He writes a text to the coffin of his wife, asking the coffin, how are you? How are things? I find this one of the most beautiful love declarations that could be made, conveyed by the agency and the materiality of the coffin. See how complex it is. You could reuse coffin probably because you didn't have wood in Egypt. And as we know, in the Third Intermediate period, they were not able to go to the Levant anymore. And where would you find a lot of wood? In coffins of the previous New Kingdom coffins. The research of Professor Clara of the University of Los Angeles has shown that up to 70% of the Third Intermediate coffins are reused for previous New Kingdom coffins. But this is the time where we do need humanists. We need historians. We need philologists. We need archaeologists. We need Egyptologists. We need sociologists to understand the data that are coming out of the analysis that we can do in the materiality. We need to go back to the text with this knowledge that we have now and to convey new questions in order to use the object and their biography to understand the people who own the objects and to construct the social and structure features of ancient Egyptian society. And let me conclude in saying that in order to do that, we need to hire in the museum more and more humanists. We need more philologists, historians, archaeologists, but we need new figures. I was hearing before the two heads of cabinets define how people are hired also within our ministry. But I would like all of you to look. For me, it's a major example that I look at very often, what the Victoria and Albert Museum is doing in London. Hiring right now sociologists and philosophers and psychologists. How can we think we can communicate with society if within our institution we do not have people who do scientific research in these fields and know what lives in society and how we can connect the cultural heritage? The new professions of museum have to be rewritten. Society is changing very quickly. And a museum cannot stand still and look. We need professionists in different fields of the social sciences and humanists that help us to understand the complex material culture that we have to take care of. Thank you.